On a Tuesday morning in July of 1978, Madison County, Iowa, felt less like the heart of the American breadbasket and more like a massive, open-air banquet for an uninvited guest. The heat was a physical weight, hitting 98 degrees by 10 o'clock in the morning, pulling moisture out of the black Iowa soil until the earth cracked into deep, jagged fissures. In the middle of those fields, the corn stood nearly 8 feet tall, a green wall that should have promised a record-breaking harvest. But if you stepped into the rows and stood perfectly still, you didn't hear the healthy rustle of leaves in the breeze. You heard a piercing, high-pitched buzz that sounded like the earth itself was screaming. It was the sound of millions of grain aphids, a black and yellow plague that had descended on the Midwest with a hunger that defied logic. The devastation was visible on every stalk. The corn leaves, which should have been wide and vibrant, were curling at the edges, covered in a sticky, black slime that trapped the Iowa dust. Beneath that slime, the aphids were literally sucking the life out of the plant, draining the sugars before they could ever reach the ears. High above the fields, the silence was shattered by the roar of crop duster engines. The plains banked low over the horizon, trailing thick, chemical mists that smelled of sulfur and desperation. This was the front line of a war that every farmer in Madison County thought they were winning with their checkbooks. That morning, 38 farmers stood in a line that wrapped around the interior of Donald Wright's agricultural supply in Winterset. They weren't there for baling wire or tractor grease. They were there to sign their names to promissory notes that most of them couldn't afford to pay back. In 1978, the agricultural world was in the middle of what people called the Great Expansion. Export markets were booming, and grain prices had hit record highs just a few years earlier. Bankers and equipment dealers were telling everyone to expand, to borrow, and to buy bigger iron. A new John Deere 4440 tractor cost over $45,000, and the chemical companies were promising that for a mere $9,000 in pesticides, a farmer could guarantee his yield against any disaster. Donald Wright was the man who sold that guarantee. He was 45 years old, wore a crisp white shirt that never seemed to show a sweat stain, and drove a brand new Cadillac that he parked right in front of the store window. He was a salesman who understood that fear was more profitable than fertilizer. "It's a simple choice, boys," Donald told the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of a man who didn't have to work the land himself. "You can sign for the $9,000 Yellow Death Regimen today and save your crop, or you can watch the bank take your farm in October. The aphids don't take holidays, and neither do the interest rates." In 1978, interest rates were already beginning the climb that would eventually peak at over 21%. The farmers in that line, men like Larry King and Paul Clark, knew the math was getting dangerous. They had seen land values triple in the last decade, but they were leveraged to the teeth. Signing for another $9,000 in chemical debt felt like a death sentence, but watching their corn shrivel into gray husks felt worse. One by one, they stepped up to the counter and signed away their year's profit. Jeffrey Wright was the last man in the store, but he wasn't in the line. Jeffrey was 61 years old and had farmed 320 acres of bottomland along the river for 35 years. He was a man with hands cracked from years of engine oil and eyes that noticed the smallest details of the natural world, the way a hoverfly hovered over a leaf or the specific shade of a ladybug's wings. He spent more time in his workshop than at the local diner, and he still used a 1961 Farmall tractor that most people in town called junkyard scrap. While the others signed for $9,000 worth of chemicals, Jeffrey walked to the back of the store, past the stacks of 5-gallon insecticide drums. He stopped in front of a small rack of garden supplies. He picked up a plain, burlap-colored bag labeled Wildflower Mix, alyssum and marigolds. He checked the price tag, $6.40. Donald Wright looked up from his stack of contracts and saw Jeffrey standing there with the small bag of seeds. He let out a laugh that stopped the conversation in the entire room. "Jeffrey," Donald said, leaning over the counter so the other farmers could hear, "I think you're in the wrong section. The Ladies' Gardening Club meets on Thursdays. We're in the middle of a plague out here. Those aphids are eating 4 bushels an hour on your North 40. You want me to put you down for a drum of yellow death? Or are you planning on asking the bugs to leave nicely?" The other farmers joined in the laughter. It was a mean, jagged sound born of their own stress. $6 worth of flowers isn't going to fill a grain bin, Jeff," Larry King said, wiping a mixture of sweat and dust from his forehead. "We're spending $9 grand because that's what it takes to protect the crop. You can't fight a biological war with a bouquet of flowers." Jeffrey didn't respond to the laughter. He felt the weight of the small bag in his hand. He looked at the men in the room, men who had forgotten the lessons their grandfathers had learned during the Depression. He knew they were looking for raw power, but they were ignoring the application of simple physics and biology. "The $9,000 you're spending is for a kill-all," Jeffrey said quietly, finally meeting Donald White's eyes. "But you're forgetting that when you kill everything, you've got to do the work of everything yourself. I'm not buying flowers to look at them, Donald. I'm buying them because I'm bringing in an army that doesn't charge $9,000, and I need a place for them to eat." "An army?" Donald barked another laugh, glancing at his Cadillac outside. "You've lost your mind, Wright. The heat's finally gotten to you. You're going to be the only man in Madison County with a beautiful flower garden and an empty bank account." Jeffrey counted out $6.40 in exact change, placed it on the counter, and walked out. That afternoon, all of Iowa mocked him as the crazy romantic who was planting flowers instead of corn in the face of a disaster. But what they didn't know was that inside that cheap seed bag, Jeffrey was hiding the most elite army agricultural history had ever forgotten. He knew something they didn't, a secret passed down to him in 1961 during the worst drought the county had ever seen. Let me tell you why this matters, because the difference between bankruptcy and a record harvest often lies in the things that other people are too proud to see. Jeffrey Wright didn't see $6 worth of seeds. He saw thousands of soldiers, hoverflies, parasitic wasps, and ladybugs that had been driven out of the modern, chemical-saturated fields and had nowhere left to go. They were looking for a hotel to stay in and a restaurant to eat pollen, and for $6.40, Jeffrey was going to build them a fortress. When the July disaster finally reached its peak, the farmers who had spent $9,000 were going to find out that chemicals have a limit. But Jeffrey Wright's secret, rooted in 1961 and applied with the precision of a master mechanic, was about to prove that sometimes the most powerful force in the world isn't the biggest gear or the most expensive chemical, but the smallest drop of oil or a $6 bag of flower seeds that keeps the whole system moving. 2 months before the first aphid was spotted in the county, the Madison County Fairgrounds hosted an emergency town hall meeting that felt more like a tent revival for industrial chemistry. The air inside the community building was thick with the smell of floor wax and the collective anxiety of 500 men who knew the 1970s boom was beginning to sour. By April of 1978, the average price of Iowa farmland had surged to over $2,000 per acre, and the pressure to produce record-breaking yields was no longer a goal. It was a survival requirement to service the massive bank loans held by almost everyone in the room. Donald White stood on the wooden stage, silhouetted against a chalkboard covered in projected profit margins and kill rate percentages. Beside him sat a gleaming, high-pressure spray rig, its stainless steel tank reflecting the overhead lights like a weapon. "The era of wait and see is over, gentlemen," Donald declared, his voice projecting with the practiced confidence of a man who owned a Cadillac and never had to worry about a failed transmission. "The grain aphid is coming, and your father's methods are about as useful as a mule in a tractor pull. This is Yellow Death. It's a systemic neurotoxin designed to wipe out the pest on contact and stay in the plant's vascular system for 45 days. He leaned forward, tapping a stack of contracts on the podium. "The regimen costs $9,000 for a 400-acre block. That sounds like a lot of money, until you realize that 1 week of an uncontrolled infestation will cost you $40,000 in lost grain weight. My rig here applies it at 400 pounds per square inch. It doesn't just mist the corn, it drives the chemical into every pore of the stalk." A frantic energy swept the room. Larry King and Paul Clark, who both operated new John Deere 4440 tractors with factory air conditioning and sound-dampened cabs, were the first to reach the stage. They didn't ask about the soil biology or the long-term effects on the water table. They only asked how quickly the rigs could be delivered. To these men, farming had become a linear equation. More money plus more chemicals equals more security. Jeffrey Wright stood at the very back of the hall, leaning against the cinder block wall. While the other farmers scrambled to sign their names to $9,000 debts, Jeffrey was studying the spray rig on the stage. He wasn't looking at the shiny tank, he was looking at the nozzle configuration and the pump assembly. With the eye of a man who had spent 30 years rebuilding seized 1948 Farmall engines, he saw a fundamental mechanical flaw that had nothing to do with the chemical itself. "That pressure is the problem," Jeffrey whispered to himself. He realized that a 400-pound per square inch blast wouldn't just deliver the toxin, It would physically crush the delicate microclimates on the underside of the leaves where beneficial life lived. It was like trying to clean a watch with a fire hose. It was an application of raw power that ignored the mechanical balance of the system. As the room buzzed with the sound of scratching pens and Donald White's predatory smile, Jeffrey's mind drifted back 17 years to the summer of 1961. He remembered standing in a parched field with his father, George Robinson, during the worst drought Madison County had ever seen. The heat had been so intense it had cracked the paint on their old Farmall M, but George hadn't been looking at the shriveling corn. He had knelt in the dusty ditch at the edge of the property, pointing to a thick cluster of white alyssum and yellow marigolds. "Look close, Jeff," George had said, his voice as steady as an idling engine. "The neighbors are plowing every inch of their ground to the fence line because they think more dirt means more money, but they're destroying the life buffer. These flowers are the hotel and the restaurant for the army that works for free. If you give the ladybugs and the hoverflies a place to stay when the corn is young, they'll be there to stand guard when the plague arrives. Nature doesn't need a $9,000 hammer. It needs a $6 balance." Jeffrey blinked, the harsh fluorescent lights of the 1978 town hall snapping him back to the present. He watched Larry King shake Donald White's hand. Larry's face tight, with the realization that he had just leveraged another year of his children's future against a drum of neurotoxin. Jeffrey didn't wait for the meeting to end. He walked out of the building, the cool April air hitting him like a relief. He drove his 1961 pickup 3 blocks down to Mary Smith's general store. Mary was 72 years old and still kept a ledger by hand, the kind of woman who remembered when every farm in the county had a garden and a windbreak instead of just endless rows of industrial corn. "Mary," Jeffrey said as he approached the counter, "I need that bag of alyssum and marigold mix from the back shelf." Mary pulled the burlap bag down, dusting it off. "Planning a garden for the wife, Jeffrey? Most of the men in town are only talking about yellow death today." "No, Mary," Jeffrey said, pulling a worn leather wallet from his pocket. "I'm buying my army's rations." He counted out exactly $6.40. It was a fraction of the $9,000 his neighbors were spending. But as he walked back to his truck, Jeffrey felt the same quiet certainty that Chester Holloway had felt when he hooked his 1930 crawler tractor to the stump that had broken a $400,000 excavator. The other farmers were betting on the show, the big machines, the expensive chemicals, and the high-pressure rigs. Jeffrey was betting on physics, biology, and the stubborn memory of 1961. He knew that in a few months, the yellow death would be screaming through the fields, but his $6 bag of seeds would be silent, waiting to trigger a symphony of life that no chemical could ever replicate. The interior of Jeffrey Wright's workshop smelled of 90-weight gear oil and cold iron, a scent that had remained unchanged since 1947, when his father first taught him that every broken machine is just a puzzle waiting for a solution. While the rest of Madison County was at the dealership signing for 6-row planters with computerized monitors, Jeffrey was on his hands and knees on a concrete floor, surrounded by the disassembled guts of a 1961 John Deere 494 planter. To a salesman like Donald White, this machine was obsolete scrap, but to Jeffrey, it was a modular platform capable of a precision that modern equipment ignored. Jeffrey didn't intend to broadcast his $6.40 worth of wildflower seeds by hand like a gardener. He was a mechanic, and he understood that success in the field was a matter of mechanical agricultural fusion. He spent 3 days modifying the drive gears of the 494, using secondary hoppers he had salvaged from an old grain drill. He wasn't just planting corn, he was engineering a landscape. He adjusted the sprocket ratios to execute a specific spatial rhythm. The planter would sow 12 rows of corn, then a concentrated 6-foot strip of alyssum and marigold seeds. As he tightened the final bolt on the seed distributor, Jeffrey explained his logic to his son, though the boy was more interested in the new John Deere 4440 tractors the neighbors were driving. "Beneficial insects aren't like a chemical army you just spray and forget," Jeffrey said, his voice level and steady. "They are like artists, and they have 2 requirements to stay on the job. They need a restaurant to eat, which is the pollen from these flowers, and they need a hotel to stay, which is the cover provided by the flower bushes. If you give them nothing but a desert of corn, they will leave for the ditches, and you will be left standing in the middle of your field with nothing but a $9,000 pesticide bill and no one to do the real work." Across the fence line, the contrast was stark. Edward Hall and Ronald Allen, 2 of the showmen of Madison County, were operating massive 1,200-gallon misting rigs. They drove brand new trucks with dealership logos on the doors, wearing clothes that stayed clean while Jeffrey's were stained with grease. They moved across their fields in a cloud of pungent, acrid fluid that burned the back of the throat and sent the birds screaming from the fence rows. Edward pulled his rig to the edge of the property, leaning out of his air-conditioned cab to look at Jeffrey's modified planter. "Hey, Wright," Edward yelled over the roar of his engine. "Are you opening a flower shop for the bugs to enjoy? Or did you just forget which bag was the corn? We're putting down 400 pounds of pressure to save our harvest. You're putting down $6 worth of marigolds. Do you think the aphids are going to stop eating because the field looks pretty?" Ronald Allen joined in from his tractor, laughing as he watched Jeffrey calibrate his antique seed plates. "You're living in 1961, Jeff," Ronald shouted. "That old iron can't keep up with modern problems. My rig makes more horsepower in one cylinder than your whole farm makes in a year." Jeffrey didn't stop his work. He didn't even look up at the shiny green equipment or the men who had leveraged their futures to buy it. He just offered a quiet, knowing smile and continued to tighten a wrench on his seed distributor. He understood the difference between horsepower and torque, and he knew that while their machines were designed for speed, his system was designed for stubbornness. He knew that the acrid mist his neighbors were spraying was a kill-all that made no distinction between the pest and the protector. They were clearing the hotels and burning the restaurants, leaving their cornfields as sterile as a laboratory floor. Jeffrey, on the other hand, was building a biological infrastructure. He was betting that when the heat of July hit and the chemical residues began to fade, his $6 hotels would be full of the most efficient predators in the natural world. As the neighbors roared away in their clouds of neurotoxin, Jeffrey Wright stood in the silence of his workshop, confident that his museum-piece planter and a handful of flower seeds were about to outthink $1 million worth of industrial technology. The heat of July 1978 didn't just bake the Iowa soil, it became the catalyst for a terrifying biological betrayal that most farmers in Madison County were completely unprepared to face. For the first 10 days after the application of Yellow Death, the $9,000 investment seemed to be paying off. Donald White's customers gathered at the diner in Winterset, bragging about the body counts in their fields. The high-pressure spray rigs had delivered a knockout blow to the initial wave of aphids, and for a brief moment, men like Larry King and Paul Clark believed they had bought their way out of the disaster. But by the third week of July, a phenomenon occurred that the chemical salesmen hadn't mentioned in their town hall presentations: the secondary outbreak. The problem was rooted in the very power the farmers had celebrated. The systemic neurotoxins and the 400-pound per square inch blast of the spray rigs had been too effective. They had wiped out the aphids, but they had also decimated every natural predator within 5 miles of the treated fields. Every ladybug, every parasitic wasp, and every hoverfly had been vaporized or poisoned. When a few surviving aphids, the ones that possessed a natural, genetic resistance to the chemicals, began to breed again, there was absolutely nothing left in the environment to stop them. Without competition or predators, the aphid population didn't just recover, it exploded at a rate that defied modern mathematics. By July 24th, Larry King's 400 acres had become a gray, suffocating graveyard. The cornstalks, which had been vibrant and green just 2 weeks earlier, began to collapse as the resistant pests sucked the remaining moisture from the vascular systems of the plants. The black slime returned, thicker and more aggressive than before. Larry had already spent his $9,000. He was leveraged to the teeth with bank loans that were renewing at 18% interest. He had no more credit, no more chemicals, and no more options. The $9,000 had vanished into the humid Iowa air, leaving behind a shriveled crop and a debt that threatened to end a 3-generation family legacy. This was the beginning of the end for the farmers who had bet everything on the show of industrial power. Let me tell you about what was happening on Jeffrey Wright's farm during those same sweltering days, because that is where the $6.40 investment finally turned into a symphony of survival. While the neighbors' fields were silent, toxic, and dying, Jeffrey's 320 acres were alive. The 6-foot strips of alyssum and marigolds he had sown with his 1961 John Deere planter were in full, glorious bloom. The white and yellow flowers swayed in the heat haze, creating vibrant ribbons of color that cut through the green wall of the corn rows. If you stood in the middle of Jeffrey's field and looked through a magnifying glass, you would see a massacre, but it wasn't the corn that was losing. The alyssum had done exactly what Jeffrey's father, George Robinson, had predicted back in 1961. Its nectar had served as a restaurant, attracting thousands of adult hoverflies from the surrounding river bluffs. These flies, sensing a perfect habitat, had laid their eggs directly into the aphid colonies on the corn leaves. When the eggs hatched, the larvae emerged. Jeffrey called them tiny meat grinders. They were legless, translucent creatures that moved with a terrifying, rhythmic hunger. A single hoverfly larva could consume 400 aphids before reaching maturity. On Jeffrey's farm, there were millions of them. They were cleaning the corn leaves with a surgical precision that no chemical spray could ever match. While the neighbor's yellow death had failed against the resistant pests, Jeffrey's biological army was adapting in real time. The more the aphids bred, the more the predators ate. It was a self-regulating system that cost nothing to maintain once it was triggered. But there was a hidden mechanical detail that Jeffrey revealed to no one but young Joshua Campbell, a neighbor's boy who had come over to see why Jeffrey's corn was still standing. Jeffrey sat on the tailgate of his 1961 pickup and pulled out an old, grease-stained notebook. Inside was a mechanical drawing dated 1961. Jeffrey hadn't just planted flowers in random strips, he had engineered wind corridors. By studying the prevailing southwesterly winds of a Madison County July, Jeffrey had positioned his wildflower strips to act as scent lures. The intense aroma of the marigolds and the sweet scent of the alyssum were caught by the breeze and funneled through the corn rows like a biological map. This scent guided the predators deep into the heart of the field, ensuring that the army reached the center rows where the aphids usually found safety. Jeffrey had used the physics of the wind and the chemistry of the plants to build a climate control system for his protectors. It was a masterpiece of mechanical and botanical fusion. Jeffrey Wright hadn't just bought a bag of seeds. He had thought the most expensive agricultural technology of 1978. He knew that raw power, the kind Donald White sold for $9,000, always had a limit. But leverage, whether it was the steel pulleys Chester Holloway used on a stump or the biological corridors Jeffrey used in a plague, was the only thing that could move a mountain. As the sun set over a county filled with shriveling corn and broken promises, Jeffrey Wright stood in his golden-green fields, listening to the quiet, efficient sound of his $6 army winning the war. On the morning of October 16, 1978, the line of grain trucks at the Madison County Farmers Co-op stretched nearly half a mile down the county road. This was the moment of the final tally, the day when the ledger of a desperate season was finally closed. The air was crisp, smelling of dried corn husks and the exhaust of idling diesel engines. But unlike the previous year's harvest, there was no celebratory chatter among the farmers. Most sat in their cabs in silence, staring at the elevators with eyes that hadn't seen enough sleep in months. Harold Turner, the manager of the grain elevator for 24 years, stood at the scale house with a clipboard that held the weight of 40 family legacies. He had watched the town hall meeting in April, and he had seen the Devitt $1,000 pesticide contracts being signed. He had also seen the yellow nightmare sweep through the county in July. As the first trucks from the Showman farms began to tip their loads, the reality of the 1978 season was laid bare. The trucks belonging to Larry King and Paul Clark, men who had used the $9,000 Yellow Death regimen and high-pressure rigs, delivered a grim result. Harold recorded the numbers as they flashed on the digital scale: 80 bushels per acre. The corn was shriveled, the kernels lacked the deep gold luster of a healthy crop, and the test weights were significantly below the regional average. The aphids had been killed, but the secondary outbreak had sucked the starch out of the grain before it could fully mature. Even worse, the moisture content was uneven, a direct consequence of the chemical stress the plants had endured throughout the summer. When Jeffrey Wright's 1961 truck pulled onto the scale, the crowd of farmers near the sample pit went quiet. They expected to see a load of screenings and flower shop debris. Instead, Harold Turner stared at the probe sample for nearly a minute before speaking. "Jeffrey," Harold said, loud enough for the men standing nearby to hear, "this corn is hitting a test weight of 58 pounds. We're looking at a record-breaking 112 bushels per acre." A collective murmur of disbelief went through the crowd. In a year where the experts and the chemical salesman had promised salvation for $9,000, a man with a $6.40 bag of flower seeds had outperformed the most expensive technology in the state by 32 bushels per acre. The math was devastating. While the neighbors were calculating how they would pay back their $9,000 chemical debts and high-interest equipment loans on 80-bushel yields, Jeffrey was looking at a net profit that was nearly triple the county average. Let me tell you about the departure of Donald White, because it tells you everything about the kind of show he was running. As the harvest results became public, the slick agricultural salesman didn't stick around to help his customers refinance or troubleshoot the failure of Yellow Death. On the afternoon of October 17th, the brand new Cadillac Seville was spotted driving toward the county line, packed with the salesman's personal belongings. He left behind 40 angry farmers and a trail of broken promissory notes. Like the showman builders who disappeared when the work got hard, Donald Wright had learned that modern machines and expensive chemicals were built for speed, but the old ways, the stubborn ways, were built for work. Jeffrey Wright didn't go to the diner to celebrate his victory. He stayed in his golden cornfield, holding a single dried marigold that had survived the first frost. He was joined by young Joshua Campbell, the boy who had watched him plant the hotels and restaurants back in the spring. Joshua looked at the corn, then at the shriveled fields across the fence. "How did it work, Mr. Wright?" the boy asked. Everyone said the flowers were just for show. Jeffrey looked at the boy, and then at the rusted 1961 John Deere planter sitting in the machine shed. "Son, in mechanics, people get confused about what makes a machine powerful," Jeffrey said, echoing the wisdom of men who had pulled stumps with antiques and rescued million-dollar excavators with steam. They think it's about the biggest gear, the most horsepower, or the loudest engine. But that's not what power is. Power is about applying force effectively. In a tractor, sometimes the most important part isn't the biggest gear, but the tiny drop of oil that keeps the whole system moving. In farming, power isn't in destroying everything you don't understand. It's in understanding how it all fits together. He patted the iron frame of the old planter. "My neighbors spent $9,000 trying to be the hammer. I spent $6.40 trying to be the oil. I gave the protectors a place to stay, and they did the work that no chemical could do." Newer isn't always smarter, and expensive doesn't always mean better. Some problems don't need more power, they need better thinking. The 1978 harvest passed into Madison County history, but the lesson of the crazy romantic remained etched into the workshops and feed stores of Iowa. Jeffrey Wright farmed his land for another 20 years, never taking out a loan and never buying another drum of yellow death. He proved that the land doesn't need more money thrown at it. It needs more time, more patience, and less debt. Today, if you drive past the old Wright farm, you won't see the latest computer-controlled spray rigs. You'll see ribbons of white alyssum and yellow marigolds swaying in the breeze between the rows of corn. They are a reminder that the people who built the country weren't always driving the newest machines or wearing the cleanest clothes. They were the ones who were stubborn enough to respect the old ways when nothing else worked. Sometimes, the solution to a $1,000 problem isn't found in an expensive chemical drum, but in a little humility toward nature and a $6.40 bag of flower seeds. That is the difference between a machine that gives up and one that doesn't know how to quit.